The lecture hall buzzed with the chittering and humming of 100 different species as they settled into their seats at the Galactic Military Academy on Station Kepler 7. Professor Velther strode to the front of the auditorium with the confident gait of someone who had delivered this lecture countless times before. His crystalline frame caught the light from the viewing ports, casting rainbow patterns across the first few rows of eager cadets. Today's topic was one of his favorites: comparative combat biology. The holographic display behind him flickered to life, showing various species from across the galactic community in their natural combat stances. "Cadets," Velther began, his voice resonating through the translation devices everyone wore. "Today, we examine why tool use became the defining characteristic of military evolution." He gestured to the display where a Vrex warrior appeared, its forearms spread wide, natural chitinous armor gleaming, razor-sharp appendages clearly visible. "The Vrex evolved as apex predators on their homeworld," he continued. "They require no weapons because they are weapons." The display shifted to show a massive Goroth, muscles rippling beneath thick hide that could deflect most small arms' fire. The Goroth possess strength and durability that makes personal armor almost redundant for them. Click after click, species after species appeared on the screen, each one demonstrating clear natural advantages in combat. Cenarius Lumians with their ability to shift molecular structure, Eccletons with their venomous, Space Orcs with their regenerative capabilities that made them nearly impossible to kill. Then the display changed to show a human. The figure stood there in standard military attire, looking almost comically vulnerable compared to the previous examples. Velther allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, letting the visual comparison sink in for his students. "And now we come to humanity," he said with something that might have been sympathy in his tone. "Perhaps the most tragic case study in our entire survey." He began the pace, warming to his subject. "Humans possess no natural armor plating or reinforced skeletal structure." The display highlighted the human skin, showing its relative fragility. Their epidermis is among the weakest of any sentient species, easily punctured or torn. Another highlight appeared around the hands. No claws, no talons, no cutting edges of any kind on their appendages. The human's mouth was magnified next, dental structure designed primarily for omnivorous consumption, not combat. Velther turned back to face his audience. No venom, no natural toxins, no defensive secretions. The display now showed a human next to a Vrex in scale comparison. Strength to mass ratio below galactic average. Another comparison appeared with a Kelth sprinter speed significantly inferior to most predator-descended species. The professor walked closer to the front row, where several cadets sat transfixed by the data. "This is why humanity became the galaxy's foremost weapon manufacturers," Velther explained. "They had no choice but to rely entirely on external tools and technology." He pulled up historical footage of human soldiers in combat, weighed down with armor, weapons, ammunition, support equipment. Remove a Vrex's weapon and they remain dangerous. Disarm a Goroth and they are still formidable. But remove a human's weapons and equipment, he paused for effect, and you have perhaps the most vulnerable sentient species in known space. The words hung in the air, like a death sentence for humanity's military reputation. Most of the alien cadets nodded along, absorbing this information as established fact. The handful of human students scattered throughout the hall sat quietly, their expressions carefully neutral. That's when it happened. From the back row, a low sound emerged, a chuckle dark and knowing. It cut through the academic atmosphere like a blade. All heads turned toward the source. Villiers, luminous eyes focused on the figure in the back corner. Staff Sergeant Maria Chen sat with her arms crossed, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The professor's tone shifted slightly, touched with irritation at the interruption. Perhaps Staff Sergeant Chun would like to share what she finds amusing about basic biological facts? Chun stood slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the lecture hall. She was not particularly imposing by human standards. Average height, lean build, but something in the way she carried herself made several nearby cadets unconsciously shift away, with respect. "Professor," she said, her voice calm and level, "you might want to revise that assessment, Velther's." Crystalline structure seemed to brighten with what might have been indignation. "Is that so?" he asked. "Perhaps you'd like to explain to the class how my research spanning 30 years and covering 700 combat-capable species is somehow flawed." Chun descended the steps between the seat rows with unhurried confidence. "I'm not questioning your research, sir," she replied. "I'm questioning your conclusions." She reached the floor level and gestured toward the holographic humans still displayed behind the professor. "You're looking at humans, as if we're failed wrecks or inadequate Goroth. That's not what we are." Velther's tone took on a lecturing quality that suggested he was about to educate this presumptuous cadet on her place. "Then please, enlighten us all as to what humans are. If not the tool-dependent species, every credible xenobiologist has classified you as..." Maria Chun's smile widened slightly, and something in that expression made the nearby Vrex cadet Crixto feel his combat instincts suddenly activate. "We're persistence predators, Professor," Chun said quietly. "We're the species that evolved to outlast everything stronger, faster, and better armed than us. We're what happens when you take away all the natural advantages and force evolution to get creative." The lecture hall had gone completely silent. Velther processed this for a moment, then made a gesture of dismissal. "Persistence hunting is well documented in human evolutionary history," he acknowledged. "But we're discussing military combat, not chasing down prey animals over days until they collapse from exhaustion. Are we, though?" Chun asked, and now there was an edge to her voice. "Because combat is just another form of hunting, Professor, and humans learned very early how to hunt things that should have been able to kill us." Velther's patience was clearly wearing thin. "This is an academic institution, Staff Sergeant, not a philosophy debate. If you believe my assessment of human combat limitations is incorrect, I welcome you to provide empirical evidence rather than romantic notions about your species' past." Chun nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for exactly this. "I accept your challenge. Professor, schedule a demonstration. No weapons, no equipment. Just basic biology. Let me show you what happens when a human has to fight without tools." The professor stared at her for a long moment, perhaps expecting her to back down when she didn't. He made a gesture of agreement. "Very well," he said. "We'll arrange a controlled combat demonstration. I assume you won't object to facing an opponent who possesses the natural advantages I've described." "I'd prefer it," Chun replied. Simply. Velther's expression suggested he thought he had just won a significant victory. "Then we'll schedule it for next week," he announced to the entire class. "And we'll all see a practical demonstration of exactly why humans need their weapons." Maria Chun returned to her seat in the back row, that same slight smile still on her face as the lecture continued. Several alien cadets glanced back at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. They thought they were about to witness a human's humiliation. Other human cadets in the room knew better. They had seen that smile before, in training and in combat. It was the smile humans wore when someone had severely underestimated them, and it usually meant someone was about to learn a very painful lesson about what humanity really was. Vol finished his lecture, completely confident in his upcoming vindication. He had no idea that in 7 days, his entire understanding of human capability would be shattered, and He certainly didn't understand that Maria Chun's chuckle in that grow hadn't been amusement, it had been recognition, the recognition of someone who had heard this speech before, from enemies who learned too late what it meant to fight a human with nothing to lose. The lecture hall emptied. Students chattering about the upcoming demonstration bets were already being placed. Almost all of them favored the alien combatant after all. Everyone knew humans couldn't fight without their weapons. Everyone except the humans. The news of the challenge spread through the academy like wildfire by the time Maria Chun reached her quarters. Her communication device was already flooding with messages from fellow human cadets and concerned alien friends. She sat on her bunk and began methodically responding to each one, her expression calm and focused in another wing of the massive station. Professor Velther was making arrangements for what he expected to be a definitive demonstration of his thesis. Selected Lieutenant Crystal, a Rex warrior with an exemplary combat record, as Chun's opponent Crystal was young but skilled, with the natural advantages of his species fully developed 4 arms, each ending in sharp chitinous blades armor plating that had turned aside, training weapons without a scratch reflexes honed by millions of years of predatory evolution. When Velther explained the situation, Crystal's initial response was concern rather than enthusiasm. "Professor, is this wise?" the Rex asked, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "I could seriously injure this human. There will be full medical teams standing by," Velther assured him. "And the match will be stopped if severe injury appears imminent. The point is to demonstrate the reality of biological limitations, not to harm." Staff Sergeant Chen Crystal agreed reluctantly, though he felt uncomfortable about the entire situation. Meanwhile, Chun's roommate, another human named Marcus Webb, watched her with concern. "You know you don't have to do this, right?" he said. "Let the professor think whatever he wants. We know what we're capable of." Maria looked up from her preparations, her expression thoughtful. "That's exactly why I have to do this. Marcus, Velther isn't just some ignorant civilian. He's training the next generation of military commanders and strategists. If they all think humans fold without our tech, that's a tactical weakness someone will eventually try to exploit." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding her point but still worried. "You planning to go full naked blade on him?" Chun smiled grimly at the reference to her old unit. The Naked Blade companies had earned a reputation during the Rim Wars that made even friendly aliens nervous. They were special operations units that deployed into hostile territory with minimal equipment, designed to operate where technology couldn't be relied upon. EMP warfare had made the Outer Rim a graveyard for electronics-dependent forces, but humans had adapted. They always adapted. "Not full," Chun replied. "This is a demonstration, not actual combat, but enough to make the point." Over the next several days, the academy buzzed with anticipation. Betting pools opened across multiple species. Social networks, the odds heavily favored Crystal, often running 20-1 against Chene. Few humans placed modest bets on their fellow soldier, but even they seemed uncertain. Chun spent her time preparing, but not in the way most expected. She didn't train harder or practice combat techniques. Instead, she reviewed Rex biology and physiology, studied their movement patterns, and spent long hours in meditation. Other human cadets noticed and began to understand she wasn't preparing to overpower Crystal. She was preparing to outlast him. On the 3rd day before the match, Chun received an unexpected visitor. Commander Dexla, a Lumian tactical instructor who had fought alongside human units during the Rim Wars, requested a private meeting. They met in one of the Academy's observation lounges. "Looking out at the stars, I wanted to warn you," Dexla said without preamble, her crystalline form shifting through concerned colors. "Velther has stacked this against you. Crystal is not just any Rex. He's a decorated combatant from the border conflicts." Chun nodded calmly. "I assumed as much. The Professor wouldn't pick someone who might accidentally prove his point wrong. Dex, Las. Colors shifted to something like respect. You're not worried? I fought Rex before, Chun replied simply. During the Rim Wars, we encountered mercenary companies of them. They're dangerous in short engagements, but every species has weaknesses. Commander, even humans. The Lumian instructor studied her for a long moment. I've seen what your kind can do when pushed, she said quietly. I was at the siege of Kappa Station. I watched human soldiers keep fighting with injuries that should have killed them. I saw one of your Marines continue operating for 17 minutes after losing an arm. It was the most terrifying display of combat capability I've ever witnessed. Chun's expression softened slightly. That Marine survived. By the way, she said, she's teaching at the academy. On Earth now, Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Holmes. She uses the story to teach new recruits about battlefield medicine and the importance of not giving up. Dex Las. Colors rippled with something that might have been amusement. Of course she survived. You humans are very difficult to kill. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Before Dex, La spoke again. May I ask you something, Staff Sergeant? What did you find funny about Velther's lecture? The assessment seemed accurate from a pure biological standpoint. Chun gazed out at the stars. Her expression distant. He's right that we don't have claws or armor or venom, she said. But he's wrong about what that means. My ancestors didn't have any of those things either. But they hunted mammoth and saber-toothed cats and cave bears. They hunted animals that could kill them with a single blow. You want to know how? Dexla indicated yes. They followed them, Chun continued. For days if necessary. They tracked wounded prey across impossible terrain. They kept going when any sane predator would have given up. Because humans have something most species don't. We can choose to ignore our bodies telling us to stop. We can decide that survival matters more than pain or exhaustion. Evolution gave us that instead of claws. The Lumian instructor processed this. That sounds more like a curse than an advantage. It is, Chen agreed. Until it isn't. Until that's the only thing standing between you and death. Then it becomes the most powerful weapon in existence. On the day before the demonstration, the human cadets held an informal gathering in their common area. Nearly 30 humans attended. From fresh cadets to veterans like Chun Marcus Webb stood up to address them. Look, we all know what tomorrow is really about, he said. It's not about Maria proving herself. It's about proving all of us. Every species here thinks we're weak without our guns and armor. Tomorrow, we show them different. The gathering erupted in agreement. But Chun raised her hand for silence. Let me be clear about something, she said firmly. I'm not doing this for pride or to show off. I'm doing this because Velther is teaching people who will make life or death decisions about us in the field. If they think we're helpless without equipment, they'll treat us that way. They'll underestimate us, or worse. They'll hesitate to work with us in situations where tech fails. She stood and faced them all. But I also need you to understand something else. What I'm going to do tomorrow. What I learned in the Naked Blade companies. It's not sustainable. It's not healthy. It's what we're capable of when everything else fails. But it shouldn't be our first choice. We use weapons and armor because they're smart tools that keep us alive. Don't mistake desperation tactics for standard procedure. The room was quiet as they absorbed this. Chun continued. After tomorrow, some of you are going to get questions from alien cadets about human capabilities. When they ask, be honest. Tell them we can fight without weapons. But we'd rather not have to. Tell them we can push through injuries. But we prefer not to get injured. The goal isn't to make them fear us. The goal is to make them respect what we bring to any fight. With or without equipment, one of the younger cadets, barely 18, raised her hand tentatively. Staff Sergeant. What was it like? The Rim Wars, I mean. Fighting without the usual support? Chen was quiet for a moment, memories flickering behind her eyes. It was hell, she said honestly. We lost a lot of good people, but we learned what we were really made of. Not the weapons or the armor or the ships. Us, the part that refuses to quit even when quitting makes sense. That's what I'm going to show tomorrow. Not superhuman strength or speed, just human stubbornness. The gathering broke up eventually, with cadets offering encouragement and support as they filed out. Marcus stayed behind with Chun. You ready for this? He asked. She smiled that same dark smile from the lecture hall. I've been ready since. Velther opened his mouth. The professor thinks he set up a demonstration of human weakness. He has no idea he's about to give a master class in why you should never assume vulnerability means helplessness. That night, Chun slept soundly across the station. Crick still barely slept it. All something about the human's confidence. Bothered him Prey didn't smile like. That Prey didn't volunteer to face predators unless they knew something the predator didn't. Professor Velther spent the evening reviewing his notes and preparing his commentary for the next day's demonstration. Had already drafted the revision to his lecture materials that he would implement after confirming his thesis. Everything was ready tomorrow. He would prove conclusively that humans needed their weapons tomorrow. The galaxy would see the truth about human limitations. He had no idea that tomorrow would change everything he thought he knew, and he certainly didn't realize that sometimes the most dangerous human is the one with nothing left to lose, or in Maria Chun's case, the one with nothing to prove except a point. The Academy's main combat training hall had been transformed into something resembling an ancient gladiatorial arena. Hundreds of seats surrounded the central floor space, and every single one was filled with cadets from dozens of species crowded together, their excited chatter creating a cacophony that the translation devices struggled to process. Faculty members occupied a special observation section with the best view of the proceedings. Medical teams stood ready at 3 different stations around the perimeter, their equipment calibrated for both Rex and human physiology. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation. Professor Velther stood at a commentary podium overlooking the arena floor, his crystalline form practically glowing with confidence. He had prepared extensive notes on Rex combat advantages and human biological limitations. This would be a teaching moment that would be remembered for years. Lieutenant Crickstell entered from the east entrance, and a wave of appreciative sounds rippled through the alien cadets. He moved with the fluid grace of a born predator, his forearms flexing, his natural armor plates gleaming under the lights. At full height, he stood nearly 7 feet tall, and his combat-ready stance made him look even more imposing. The Rex acknowledged the crowd with a gesture, then moved to his starting position from the west entrance. Maria Chun walked in alone. She wore standard academy training attire, simple pants and a sleeveless shirt that left her arms bare. No armor, no protective gear, nothing but the clothes and her own body. Compared to Crickstyle, she looked almost fragile. The contrast was stark enough that several cadets winced in sympathetic anticipation of what they expected to see. Chen walked to her starting position with unhurried calm, her movements economical and precise. She met Crickstyle's eyes across the arena floor and gave him a small nod of respect. The Rex returned the gesture, though his mandibles clicked with what might have been nervousness. Tar's voice boomed through the hall's audio system. Today, we observe a practical demonstration of the concepts discussed in our comparative combat biology lecture. Lieutenant Crickstell represents a species evolved for natural combat capability. Staff Sergeant Chun represents humanity, a species that evolved with minimal combat advantages. This match will continue until one combatant yields, is rendered unable to continue, or until medical staff determine that continued combat presents unacceptable risk of permanent injury. He paused dramatically. Let the demonstration begin. A tone sounded, and Crickstale immediately shifted into an aggressive posture. His predator instincts kicked in, and he began to circle. Looking for an opening, Chun didn't adopt any recognizable fighting stance. She simply began moving, circling in the opposite direction, her eyes never leaving her opponent. The crowd grew quiet, expecting immediate engagement, or Frickstall fainted forward. Testing Chun's reactions, she smoothly stepped back. Maintaining the distance between them, he feinted again. Faster this time. Again. She evaded. Not even attempting to counterattack. 2 minutes passed with no contact. Some in the crowd began to murmur. Was the human too afraid to fight? Crickstall lunged properly this time, closing the distance with impressive speed. His forearms reaching to grapple Chun. Didn't try to block or stand her ground. She simply wasn't there when he arrived. Having pivoted away at the last possible moment, of Rex's momentum carried him past her starting position. He spun quickly, refusing to give her his back. But she hadn't tried to attack. She was already moving again, circling, staying just out of reach. 5 minutes passed. Then, Crickstall had attempted 7 serious engagements. Each one met with evasion rather than resistance. Commentary had slowed, and then stopped as he watched with growing confusion. This wasn't going as he had predicted. 15 minutes into the match, something became obvious to the more observant spectators. Crickstall was breathing heavily. His movements, while still dangerous, had lost some of their initial snap and precision. Chun, meanwhile, showed no signs of fatigue. Her breathing remained steady and controlled. She continued moving with the same economical grace as when she started. Thexela, watching from the faculty section, leaned toward a colleague. She's not trying to beat him, the Lumian said quietly. She's trying to outlast him. The other instructor, a Gorath named Morthok, rumbled agreement. Persistence hunting, he said. Like in the old records from Earth. She's treating this like a long-distance chase. 20 minutes in, Crickstall was visibly struggling. Vrex's physiology was built for explosive power and short, decisive engagements. Their predator ancestors had relied on ambush tactics and overwhelming force. Extended combat was not in their evolutionary playbook. For the first time, Chun moved in actively rather than just evading. Crickstall, tired and frustrated, took the bait and lunged aggressively. Chun didn't try to match his strength. Instead, she used his own momentum against him, a technique that required timing rather than power. Her hands found the joint where one of his arms connected to his body, and she applied pressure at a precise angle. The Vrex warrior made a pained sound and stumbled. Chun disengaged immediately. Back to circling. Crickstall recovered quickly, but now there was something new in his eyes. Uncertainty. He had just experienced something that didn't fit his understanding of how combat worked. The weaker creature had hurt him by using leverage and precision instead of force. The match continued at 25 minutes 30 Cricks. Tal's movements were now noticeably slower. His armor, which had seemed like such an advantage at the start, was now working against him. The additional weight, combined with his species' naturally higher metabolism, meant he was burning through energy at an unsustainable rate. Chun continued her patient, relentless movement. She was beginning to show signs of exertion now, a sheen of sweat on her skin, but her pace never wavered. At 32 minutes, Crickstall made a desperate all-out assault. All forearms swept toward Chun in a pattern designed to leave no escape route. For the first time, she didn't fully evade. One of his chitinous appendages caught her across the shoulder, tearing through fabric, and skin. Blood welled immediately running down her arm. Several cadets gasped. The medical teams started to move forward, but Chun didn't stop, didn't even slow down. She took the hit, absorbed the damage, and in the same motion, slipped inside Kriegstahl's guard. Her elbow struck him at the vulnerable joint, where his head connected to his thorax, not hard enough to cause serious damage, but hard enough to stagger him. As he reeled back, she swept his legs. Using technique rather than strength, the massive Rex warrior went down hard. The arena fell silent. Chen stepped back, blood still flowing from her shoulder wound, and waited. Kriegstahl tried to rise. His arm shook with the effort. He made it to his knees, then tried to stand. His legs wouldn't support him. 35 minutes of continuous combat had depleted his reserves completely. He tried again, and his body simply refused to respond. The Rex warrior looked up at Chen, and she saw the exact moment he understood. She wasn't stronger, she wasn't faster, she wasn't better armed. She had just outlasted him. It was biologically impossible by his understanding. Yet here she stood, bleeding and battered, but still functional. While he couldn't even get to his feet, Kriegstahl lowered his head in a gesture of submission. "I yield," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The medical teams rushed forward immediately, to everyone's surprise. They had to provide more immediate attention to Kriegstahl than to Chen. He was suffering from severe metabolic depletion and would need hours of recovery. Chen's shoulder wound was cleaned and sealed with medical adhesive, a process that took less than 5 minutes. She refused pain medication, saying she wanted to keep a clear head. Professor Velther stood at his podium, absolutely speechless. Everything he thought he knew about human combat capability had just been overturned in 35 minutes. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some species cheered for the impressive display. Others sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. The human cadets in attendance were smiling, not with triumph, but with recognition. They had seen this before, in training or in combat simulations. This was what humans did when everything else was stripped away. They endured as Chen walked out of the arena, declining medical transport and insisting she could walk on her own. She passed close to Velther's position. The professor looked down at her, his crystalline features showing something like shock. "How?" he asked simply. Chen paused and looked up at him. "You were right about everything you said in your lecture, Professor," she replied. "We don't have claws or armor or natural weapons. But you missed what evolution gave us instead. We got the ability to keep going when our bodies are screaming at us to stop. We got the capacity to choose endurance over sense. And we got the evolutionary experience of being prey that learned to hunt predators by simply refusing to die." She nodded toward where the medical teams were still working on Kriegstahl. "He's stronger, faster, and better armed than me. But my ancestors evolved to hunt creatures that were stronger, faster, and better armed than them. We learned to win by being the ones still standing when everyone else has collapsed." With that, she continued walking, leaving Velther staring after her. Lecture hall might have taught comparative biology, but the arena floor had just taught a far more important lesson. Never assume that vulnerability means weakness, and never ever underestimate what a human can do when they decide that stopping isn't an option, because humans didn't become the galaxy's foremost weapon manufacturer. The Academy's medical center hummed with quiet activity as Chen sat on an examination table, finally allowing the doctors to conduct a thorough examination of her injuries. The shoulder wound had been properly sealed, but they wanted to check for internal damage and monitor her for signs of metabolic shock in the recovery bay next door. Kriegstahl was hooked up to nutrient feeds and monitoring equipment, his body slowly recovering from the severe depletion he had experienced. The door to Chen's exam room slid open, and Professor Velther entered, his crystalline form seeming somehow dimmer than usual. "May I speak with you, Staff Sergeant?" he asked formally. Chen gestured to a chair. "Of course, Professor. Though I should warn you, the doctors say I need to stay here for observation for another hour." Velther settled into the seat, silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, His voice carried none of its usual academic confidence. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not just for underestimating you personally, but for fundamentally misunderstanding your entire species." Chun shook her head slightly. "You weren't wrong about the biology, Professor. Everything you said about human physical limitations was accurate. We are fragile compared to most sentient species. We do lack natural weapons and armor." Velther's form brightened slightly. "Then help me understand what I witnessed today. By every metric I know, you should have been defeated in the first serious engagement. Yet you endured for 35 minutes and emerged victorious. How is that possible?" Chen was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Tell me, Professor, what do you know about Earth's evolutionary history? The actual conditions my ancestors evolved in?" Velther accessed his data files mentally. Earth is classified as a high-gravity death world with extreme environmental variation, multiple climate zones, significant seasonal changes, diverse predator species, standard evolutionary pressure environment. Standard? Chun smiled slightly. "Professor, my homeworld tried to kill everything on it for millions of years. Ice ages that lasted thousands of years, followed by periods of extreme heat. Predators that could run faster, hit harder, and were better armed than early humans. Diseases, parasites, environmental hazards at every turn." She shifted on the examination table, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her shoulder. "My ancestors weren't the strongest creatures on Earth," she continued. "They weren't the fastest or the toughest. But they had something else. They could adapt to conditions that would kill specialized predators. They could survive injuries that would leave other animals helpless. And most importantly, they could decide that survival mattered more than pain or exhaustion." Velther processed this information, his academic mind working through the implications. "You're describing psychological resilience as an evolutionary advantage." "Yes," Chun confirmed. "Because that's exactly what it is. My species evolved the ability to override our body's safety mechanisms. We can choose to keep functioning when we should shut down. We can push through pain that would incapacitate species with more robust biology. It's not that we don't feel it. Professor, we feel everything. We just learn to keep going anyway." The professor stood and began pacing, a habit he fell into when processing new concepts. "This explains the historical records I've been reviewing since the demonstration," he said. "Human soldiers continuing to fight with catastrophic injuries. Human explorers surviving in conditions that killed members of supposedly hardier species. Your kind's reputation for what others call irrational determination." Chun nodded. "We call it stubbornness or grit depending on context. But yes, that's the core of it. Evolution couldn't give us claws or armor, so it gave us the ability to simply refuse to quit." Velther turned to face her fully. "But what cost?" "The strain I witnessed on your physiology during that match. The way you continued functioning while bleeding from a wound that should have forced you to seek medical attention. This cannot be without consequences." "You're right," Chun admitted, her expression growing more serious. "It comes with a price. Humans can push themselves to death if we're not careful. We can ignore warning signs that other species would instinctively respond to. Our psychological override can become psychological damage if we're not careful." She gestured to her injured shoulder. "This is actually relatively minor," she said. "I've seen humans keep fighting with far worse. I've done it myself during the Rim Wars. But every time we do it, we're making a choice. And that choice has consequences for our long-term health and well-being." Velther sat back down, his entire demeanor now that of a student rather than a teacher. "Tell me about the Rim Wars," he requested. "About the naked blade units you mentioned in class. I want to understand the practical application of what you demonstrated today." Chun was quiet for a moment, memories flickering behind her eyes. The Rim Wars were fought in a region of space where electronic warfare had evolved to the point that most technology couldn't be relied upon. She began. EMP bursts, signal jamming, viruses that could corrupt ship systems. Traditional military doctrine fell apart. The naked blade companies were the solution. She continued. We deployed with minimal electronic equipment, basic supplies, non-electronic weapons when available, and training in what they called biological warfare. Valther's form brightened with alarm. You used biological weapons? Chun smiled grimly. Not that kind of biological warfare. We used our biology as the weapon. We went into hostile territory and survived through the same methods my ancestors used. Persistence, adaptability, and sheer refusal to die. She stood and walked to the window. Looking out at the stars, we drop into enemy-held regions and operate for weeks with no support. She said, we couldn't call for help because communications would give away our position. We couldn't rely on our equipment because it would fail or be detected. So we relied on what evolution gave us. Some missions lasted months. She continued quietly. We lost people, not to enemy action always, but to exhaustion, disease, injuries that we couldn't treat properly. Because the thing about human endurance is that it's not infinite. We can push farther than most species. But we're not invincible. Valther absorbed this information, his academic understanding expanding to include the darker implications. Yet you volunteered for this demonstration. He observed, knowing the risks, knowing the cost. Why? Chun turned to face him. Because you're teaching the next generation of military commanders, she said simply. And if they go into combat thinking humans are helpless without our technology, people will die. Human soldiers will be misdeployed or abandoned. Worse, enemies might target our supply lines, thinking it will cripple us. But you made another point in your lecture that needs addressing, she continued. You said we became the galaxy's foremost weapon manufacturers because we had to. That's half true. We became the best at making weapons because we understand what weapons are really for. Valther tilted his head in question. Most species think weapons are about overcoming biological limitations. Chun explained. And that's true for them. But for humans, weapons are about not having to use our biological capabilities. Because every time we push ourselves to the limit, every time we override our safety mechanisms, we pay a price. Better weapons and better armor mean we don't have to pay that price as often. The professor was silent, processing this perspective shift finally. He spoke. I've been teaching comparative combat biology for 30 years, he said. And I've always approached it from the perspective of natural advantages. Claws are better than no claws. Armor is better than no armor. But you're suggesting that human adaptability represents a different kind of advantage, one that comes with different costs and benefits. Chun nodded. Exactly. Crickstel is a better fighter than me in almost every measurable way. But I have the capacity to outlast him because my evolutionary path gave me endurance instead of power. Neither is objectively better. They're different solutions to the problem of survival. Valther stood again, his form brightening with what might have been excitement. This changes everything, he said. Not just my lecture on human combat capability, but my entire framework for understanding military biology. I've been comparing species as if they're all trying to solve the same problem in different ways. But humans aren't trying to be better Vrex or improved Gorth. Chun smiled. We're trying to be the best humans we can be, which means understanding our strengths and our limitations, using tools and technology to cover our weaknesses, and knowing when we can push beyond normal limits and when we absolutely have to stop. Door slid open and one of the medical staff entered. Staff Sergeant Chun. Your observation period is complete, the doctor said. You are cleared to return to normal duties. though we recommend light activity for the next few days while your shoulder heals." Chun thanked the doctor and turned back to Velthar. "Professor, if you're serious about revising your curriculum, I'd be willing to help, but on one condition." "Name it." Velthar said immediately. "We also teach the limitations," Chun said firmly. "Not just what humans can do, but what we shouldn't do. The cost of pushing too hard. Too often. Because the galaxy doesn't need to fear human endurance." 3 weeks had passed since the demonstration, and the same lecture hall where everything began was once again filled to capacity. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The cadets who filed in weren't just there for a required class word. Had spread about Professor Velthar curriculum, and the attendance included students from other programs who had requested special permission to observe. The professor stood at the front of the auditorium, his crystalline form reflecting the morning light from the viewports beside him. In a guest lecturer's chair sat Staff Sergeant Maria Chun. Her shoulder wound healed to little more than a thin line. The holographic display behind them showed the familiar title, Comparative Combat Biology, but the subtitle had changed from Biological Advantages and Limitations to Understanding Diverse Combat Adaptations. Velthar called the class to order, and the hall fell silent. "Cadets," he began, his voice carrying a new tone of humility. 3 weeks ago, I stood in this very spot and delivered a lecture that was factually accurate but fundamentally flawed." He gestured to the holographic display where images of various species appeared. "I showed you the natural weapons of the Vrex, the armor of Dagorath, the abilities of dozens of species, and then I showed you humanity and described them as biologically deficient." The display shifted to show footage from the Teotihuacan demonstration, carefully edited to show key moments. "I was correct about the facts," Velthar continued. "Humans lack natural weapons, armor, venom, and many other combat advantages. But I was catastrophically wrong about what those facts meant." He nodded to Chun, who stood and joined him at the front. "Staff Sergeant Chun taught me, quite literally through demonstration, that combat capability cannot be measured purely by comparing physical attributes. Humans evolved a different solution to the problem of survival. And today, we're going to explore what that means for military operations across all species." Chun stepped forward, her presence commanding despite her relatively small stature compared to many in the room. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to make something clear. What I did in that demonstration is not something I'm proud of in the way you might think. I'm not proud that I can push my body past reasonable limits. I'm proud that I survived situations where I had to. There's a difference." The cadets listened intently as she continued. "Human endurance is a tool. Like any other weapon or piece of equipment, it has appropriate uses and inappropriate uses. Today, we're going to talk about both." Velthar brought up a new series of displays showing human evolutionary history. "Let's start with understanding why humans evolved the way they did," he said, following the lesson plan he and Chun had developed. Together, the next hour was unlike any lecture the Academy had seen. Before Velthar presented the biological and environmental factors that shaped human development, while Chun provided practical context from human military history. They discussed persistence hunting and how it translated to modern military endurance. They examined case studies from the Rim Wars, where human units succeeded in conditions that defeated better-equipped forces from other species. They analyzed the psychological mechanisms that allowed humans to override their biological safety systems, but they also, critically, discussed the cost. Chun pulled up medical data from her own service record, showing the long-term effects of repeated extreme exertion. "This is from my 3rd deployment in the Naked Blade companies," she explained, showing physiological stress markers that made several medical students in the audience gasp. "I pushed too hard. Too often. without adequate recovery time. It took me 6 months of physical therapy to fully recover. And I was one of the lucky ones. She showed anonymized records from soldiers who hadn't been as fortunate, permanent injuries from pushing through damage that should have stopped them, psychological trauma from operating at extreme stress levels for extended periods, metabolic disorders from repeatedly depleting their body's resources. This is what happens when you mistake capability for invulnerability, Chum said firmly. Humans can push beyond normal limits, but every time we do, there's a price. Good commanders know when that price is worth paying. Great commanders find ways to achieve objectives without requiring their soldiers to pay it. Welther took over, presenting comparative analysis of different species' combat doctrines. What we're seeing across the galaxy is that each species has evolved different strengths, he explained. The Vrex excel at short, decisive engagements. The Gorath dominate in sustained frontal assault. The Lumians thrive in environments requiring adaptability. And humans, he paused. Humans have evolved to be the galaxy's ultimate backup plan. Chan smiled at the description. That's actually a perfect way to put it. Professor, she said, in mixed species units, humans often aren't the first choice for any specific role. There's usually someone better suited. But when things go wrong, when equipment fails, when the mission extends beyond expected parameters, when injuries occur and soldiers need to keep functioning, that's when human evolutionary advantages matter most. She pulled up tactical analyses from joint operations. Here's a good example, she said, pointing to a mission report. Human and Vrex forces were pinned down after an equipment failure disabled their transport. The Vrex warriors were more effective in direct combat, but the operation extended over 4 days with limited supplies. By day 3, the Vrex were operating at reduced capacity due to metabolic constraints. The human soldiers, while less effective in individual engagements, maintained operational capacity throughout. Together, they succeeded where either species alone would have failed. Welther nodded approvingly. This is the key insight that my previous curriculum missed. Combat capability isn't about ranking species from strongest to weakest. It's about understanding how different evolutionary solutions create different tactical opportunities. The lecture continued with practical applications. They discussed how to structure mixed species units to maximize complementary strengths. They examined training protocols that could help other species extend their operational endurance. They analyzed how understanding human capabilities could improve strategic planning. Then Chun moved into territory that made some of the cadets uncomfortable. Now, we need to talk about the psychological aspects, she said, because this is where things get complicated. She brought up footage from various human military operations, showing soldiers continuing to fight in conditions that seemed impossible. What you're seeing is the human psychological override in action, she explained. The ability to decide that mission completion or survival of comrades matters more than personal safety or comfort. Every sentient species has some version of this, she continued. But humans have it to a degree that other species find disturbing. We can watch fellow soldiers die and continue operating. We can sustain horrific injuries and keep fighting. We can go days without sleep, food, or water when necessary. She paused, her expression serious. But here's what you need to understand as future commanders. Just because we can do these things doesn't mean we should. Humans who operate at extreme levels for too long develop psychological damage. We call it various things: combat fatigue, post-traumatic stress, burnout. But it all comes down to the same thing. Our override system has limits, and exceeding those limits breaks us in ways that are hard to fix. Welther added supporting data showing comparative psychological resilience studies. What the research shows is that humans can tolerate higher acute stress than most species, he explained. But they require longer recovery periods afterward. Commanders who fail to account for this recovery time end up with soldiers who are physically capable, but psychologically compromised. Cadet in the front row, a young Celth, raised a question. Staff Sergeant, how do you know when you've pushed too far? Chun considered the question carefully. Honestly, often you don't know until afterward, she admitted. That's why it's dangerous. The same psychological mechanism that lets us push through injuries also makes it hard to recognize when we're damaging ourselves. This is why human military doctrine emphasizes mandatory rest periods and psychological evaluation. We know we can't trust ourselves to voluntarily stop. She smiled slightly. It's one of the more embarrassing aspects of human biology. We're the species that has to be ordered to take care of ourselves. The lecture moved into its final phase. Practical integration strategies Chen and Velther presented. Recommendations for mixed species command structures. They discussed how to recognize when human soldiers were approaching their limits. They provided guidelines for planning operations that accounted for different species. Endurance profiles. Then Chen made an unexpected announcement. Professor Velther and I have been approved to develop a new elective course, she said. It's called Cross-Species Tactical Integration. It will focus on how to maximize the effectiveness of mixed species units by understanding and leveraging each species' evolutionary advantages. We'll be accepting applications next week. The response was immediate. Dozens of hands shot up with questions about the course. Velther fielded them with enthusiasm, clearly excited about this new direction in his teaching.